So we're live. Welcome to Innovation Hour with Edgar and JSaye. I'm JSaye, but we also have a super special guest that came on last week that was so good that we needed to double dip and see where the conversation went when we kept diving deeper and added some of the brilliance of Edgar into it. So quick introductions. I'm JSaye. I'm based out of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, innovation consultant. Edgar Papke, who are you? What do you do?
I wear I wear several hats, and my primary focus is helping leaders and organizations create aligned cultures of innovation, and to explore design and innovation in business and in government.
Awesome. And there's another John on the line. I am the John with slightly more hair, Jon Walton. Quick intro from you.
All right, the less hairy John here. I'm in Colorado, and my work primarily focuses on working with teams and organizations and leaders that are focused on innovation as well, kind of like Edgar. And my take is it on the multicultural, intercultural aspects, and how do I use the diversity and the programs within my organization or my team to really get the most out of them.
Fantastic. Well, last week we started a conversation that we're going to finish today, but we did cover a wide range of topics. A lot of it was based on the experience that John and I have both lived traveling, working in different areas, different sectors, and working with different companies. And so we talked a lot about one's ability to understand the interactions that we have with others and practices to try and gain perspective. Today we're going to talk about a little bit of that, but we're going to bounce off into broader aspects of that, and also how the current climate, social climate, affects your business and your practices within that profession, not just personal. We went personal a lot last week. I think we'll try and integrate some more professional and some tips that you can take out and actually apply. So I'm going to pass the ball over to Edgar. Edgar, what lens of focus should we start with, as you would like to call it?
I think a great lens to look at this all through is taking the current context that we're in and our observations and what we can learn from the experience that we're currently having. If you look at yourself and the people around you, this is the opportunity for a truly contextual inquiry, which is about people's experiences and what we can learn from them. I think one of the keys here that I'm seeing is that there is not just a opportunity at the organizational level, at the business level. I think it extends itself into the social realm, yeah, and the interplay of business and society. And also, I think there's a really wonderful opportunity for us to explore and examine how globally we think, and how globally we think about the human experience and the better understanding of our human social systems, and how we use that aspect of experience and integrate and marry that with what we know in terms of our digital capability. And what that reminds us of, first and foremost, and my observation of that, is that right now we're reminded of the importance of looking through the lens of human social systems and seeing what kind of data we're even looking at in the first place. And from there, we can get a much deeper, richer understanding of what the possibilities are of how it is that we solve problems.
Wow, yeah. Well, solving problems, particularly these types of problems that are, you could call them wicked problems, extremely complex, haven't been figured out in really any society very well right now, at least in the modern society we're living in. Where does one start? Where's the pinpoint where we can say, all right, this is the first step in the right direction?
Well, I think one of the things that we're all observing, and Jon Walton and we've been having a bit of this conversation already. I think one of the things that we're observing first and foremost, and I think we've touched on this already over the last several weeks, is the messaging that organizations are using. And it seems like it's the messaging is all geared pretty much to just satisfying an itch around we have to say something, and we have to at least have the appearance that we're concerned and we're doing something about it. And I think that actual problem solving, then that's a different place to go to.
Mm-hmm.
And so to begin to have a consciousness and awareness that this is the opportunity right now. I mean, it's always there. And this is what innovation is about, is designing solutions to problems. I think right now, I think we have to be able to grapple with and understand the role of business in our society. And this goes back to something we've also talked about, is that our society as a whole globally is a business society. We've done this incredible job of creating a global business society, and we have to be able to understand. And I think business leaders right now are really grappling with this: is what's their role in all of this, and how do they actually step in to solve real problems? And those are around social systems that business helps to create. So how much of a responsibility is there to that? Beyond the accountability, responsibility, the ability to respond to the current situation. I think we begin with that simple idea and understanding of the importance of that business has such an incredible influence on our social systems.
Yeah, it definitely. You go ahead, John. You go ahead. Take this.
No, Edgar, I think you're right, because as we've talked, and I just hung up the phone a little bit ago and having a discussion with someone about this kind of similar issue in terms of how it is that we're looking at this challenge, right? And so you, Edgar, I think started off by saying, business driving social system solutions. And, this is one where it almost feels to me where I'm seeing business leaders are taking their cues from the social sector and the social world, right? And so we're seeing socially, a lot of upheaval and discomfort. I don't mean upheaval in terms of riots and that, but a lot of discomfort, and people are having this awakening, or maybe the second awakening. And the conversation is that I had with someone a little bit ago was, didn't we already do this? Didn't we already have kind of, at least from the corporate side, these equity and inclusion programs and unconscious bias training and all of that? But what seems to have changed that is that people feel it differently now. Mm-hmm. Right. And so there's something that's changed in our society that's making people feel this or connect to it in a different way than what we saw in the past. And to me, that's what's really interesting right now, is that what is it? What's caused that? And then kind of to your point, Edgar, then how does that show up in the business world?
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something here that's really important, and that is that we've been on this path, and organizations, corporations have been creating programs for quite a while. I think at this point, I think you're right. It's what's the true meaning and significance of the programs, and then also how well have we over across the board actually invited people of color and what we would typically think of as underrepresented minorities. How much have we invited and brought them to the table of truly being at the leadership table and being a part of that conversation? So it's not just we have a diversity inclusion platform that we're working from, but really what are the true outcomes and goals that we create through that? And this has a lot to do then with how it is that we design solutions, whether it's a product or service solution, how well we do that, having a broader span of understanding. The whole idea of contextual inquiry is to understand the experience of people. Mm-hmm. And I think you're right, John. Right now, the experience is front and center in a very powerful way. And I think what we can learn from that is to think and learn to think much more expansively than we have. And also then that allows us to also think about the solutions that we create a much more global platform as well. That unless we integrate this into how we truly lead the organizations and not just speak to inclusion and diversity, how we actually lead and create leadership that integrates that, I think the programs are going to remain being programs. And I think you're right. I think now is a wonderful opportunity. And it does show up in innovation. It does show up in the design of solutions, because we have a different way of coming at it. And we have a different way of listening to one another then. and to do that with a greater level of inquiry, with less defensiveness and with less protectiveness around our ideas, rather expansiveness of our thinking and the potential for and possibilities for ideas.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, John, also that in the past, it's you were having a conversation with someone that in the past we've tried things before, right? Like it seems like we've gone in a bit of a circle. Like when you look back to affirmative action and when all these different types of business structures were put in so that people would have more opportunities. Well, they progressed society some, but then they kind of flamed out and didn't do what they were supposed to. And then you've got lawsuits going against them from other minorities. So it's become this mess that inhibited some and didn't really do what it was intended to do. I know we're not experts here, but I would love to dive in and see what was the problem. My thoughts is in a design mindset, the structure, the function, the concept was correct, but what went wrong with it? Why didn't it do what it was supposed to? The desired outcome was clear, but why didn't it get there? So to prevent us from going in circles, I definitely think we need to analyze that and dive deep into that before we try and go ahead and create another solution. A lot of people have tried things already. Maybe we could try and pull from our past and resources of others and really combine to make a better solution. I know in my time in Spain, women's rights was a big key point for our company at IBM. Spain had come out of the dictatorship only in 76. So the progression from 76 to 2020 has been massive. But they were trying to structure women's movement through the company in a way that gave them a better footing. Because men, well, we don't get pregnant, so we don't physically need to take time off at all for pregnancy. Emotionally, we might need to take that time off, right? But physically we don't. So men were getting constantly bumped up in their position because they weren't missing that time. So IBM was working to create a structure that tried to create an even playing field. Doing that can work at times, or it can become a disaster. So I wouldn't know where we start as a society to try and link those points, or as a business. John, you got any ideas?
I don't know that I necessarily have ideas. I mean, I got some ideas, but I think your point about looking at the lessons we've learned, right? And so where have we gone wrong in the past? Where do we get it right? Is a good question. The thing that comes back to me in the conversations I'm having with leaders and with my friends right now is around fear, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I've got to ask that question: is fear something that has inhibited our ability to fully address this problem? Is my fear and my concern over saying the right thing or the wrong thing, or getting it wrong, or not being PC, or not, whatever it is that keeping us in status quo? Because honestly, from my perspective, we largely have maintained the status quo, right? We really haven't seen any big systemic changes. And so I think that it largely has to do with our fear to kind of address this harder, more painful issue. And, something I thought of this morning as I was listening to the radio or something was, what's that capacity, or why is it that capacity in this one space is limited? Mm-hmm. Because usually folks think, oh, I can get it right. I can solve any problem. I'm a smart person. But for some reason, this presents a block, I think, for many people. And I think it's maybe because they don't feel they have the expertise, or that you have to be a minority to have knowledge. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your perspective, or even Edgar's, on this, especially around the fear piece.
Edgar, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think you've pretty much identified it. So in order for us to really, if we want to truly innovate well and create solutions, then we have to understand the experience for whom it is that we're creating the product or service or the societal change for. And I think so fear can show up in a couple of ways. And I think that the key fear here is I have to be able to look at myself and be able to understand my experience through the lens of understanding where my fears are, including my own defensiveness, that maybe I'm not doing this well enough, or I haven't done it well enough, or just the fear of how it is that you're going to perceive me. So in order to do this at I think the level that we have to get to is we have to look at design through this level of awareness and awareness. So when you look at the levels of design, moving from the visual to touch and feel, physical, and then systems and processes and systems, and then organizational, societal context, then the next level, I think, and this is where we've come to now, is designing through the level of awareness and the awareness of our emotion at a deeper level, to really understand where fear comes from. I can't do great contextual inquiry, understand your experience, until I'm aware of my fear and my filtering of how I'm going to interpret your experience. And so my ability to listen and understand your experience, I have to be able to move through and work through that fear that I have. When we think about different levels of how we listen to one another, there's actually 5 different levels. The bottom level is I don't hear you. This is where I shut you out. I put up the listening blinders, so to speak. And there's a lot of this stuff going on right now where we're really not even wanting to hear from different people about what's going on around us. By the way, same thing happens in organizations. Leaders can fall into this. I don't hear you, which is just a step beyond where we listen to actually argumentatively reject someone. So I argue, I reject your point of view. And that's not listening either. That's just waiting, and we step on each other, and we don't listen well. And then there's the next level of listening where I'm actually experiencing where most people are operating today. And it's the most common archetypal level of listening, which is argumentative rejection, beyond argumentative rejection into persuasive rebuttal. So now what I'm doing is I'm listening to you just so that I can collect the ammunition to tell you what I really think. And most of our time we spend listening at that level. If we move beyond that, then we actively engage in a listening so that we can test to make sure that we're hearing the other person correctly. And beyond that, the highest form is what I like to refer to as fearless exploration. And in order to fearlessly explore your experience, your point of view, your experience at a deep level, and trying to really work with empathy to understand it, I have to at the same time be conscious of my fear. I have to be able to understand what's going to get in the way of my listening to you, and work at listening at that level. And that isn't easy to get to. And Jon, what you're suggesting here, around the fear piece of it, is I'm not even conscious of my fear. How am I going to be able to listen to you? And in a design team, it could be anything from that I believe my ideas are better than yours, and I don't want to run the risk or run the fear that I'm less competent than you are, or that I'm not going to be heard at the level you are, that I'm not going to be respected at the level that you are, and all these different elements are kicking around. Well, in how it is that we listen and do contextual inquiry to try and understand somebody else's experience and really understand what the right problems are that need to be solved, we've got to be conscious of and be able to accept and work through our own fears. So I think you've hit it right on the nail head, and that requires us to design at that level of awareness, and that awareness asks for us to understand our own emotional biases that we carry with us, because that's where the fears show up, and be able to open up to really listen to each other, which isn't easy. I think one of the reasons, I'm going to go back to something that you questioned before that you brought up so well, Jon, was this JSaye, is this idea of why programs have failed in the past. I think one of the reasons that they haven't done what we intended them to do in the past is because we didn't go back and fearlessly explore by getting the right feedback.
Yeah.
It's kind of like going out to solve problems for somebody and then handing them a solution without actually listening to them and asking them what the right problem is to be solved, and engage them in creating the solution together. And I think what gets in the way of that is fear.
Yeah, I was talking to someone in HR earlier, and we were talking about, the resurgence in bias trainings and all of that. And I said, well, Warmth Club, everyone, people were kind of down on bias trainings, because of whether or not they really are effective. And now it seems as though the same audiences are asking for that training again, and it's more about their receptiveness, right? To engage in that training. So maybe I realized that before I wasn't in a position, I had blockers up or whatever was going on, that I wasn't willing to fully engage in that training. And now that I've seen and I have a greater social awareness, it enables me to maybe relook at that with a different lens or with a different understanding. Now I'd be curious to see, again, back to effectiveness, like, well, do we get better results that if people are willing to go through training, or we're going to look at the way we innovate or the way that we didn't innovate, is that going to be a place to allow for change? Can we do it that way, I guess, is really my question. And I guess I say, I think that obviously, and we're talking about this, you have to be receptive, right? I mean, you have to be open and receptive to the lessons you're going to hear, to the experiences people are going to share with you, to the idea that someone has fears where you may not have fears, as a way to get through this wall and a way to get to proper solutioning. Now, it's interesting to me to start to think about, how do you elicit that? How do you ask people about their experiences and those behaviors when we talk about innovation, and going back to JSaye's question, right?
Yeah.
Because that then gets to be a little bit trickier. How honest am I willing to be, one, with myself, but also with you, and especially if you is my employer.
Yeah, and I mean, when you asked about fear, I walked through 100 stories in my head trying to figure out what exactly was the fear that kind of stopped, you could say, the majority from reaching over and helping everybody up to their potential, right? And it took me to my granddad. My granddad's from a town that's tiny. He went to schoolhouse his whole life that had 13 students in it, went to medical school at a super young age, was born a genius, so he really didn't have to work much for it, but came from this place of extreme racism, really. I mean, backwoods of Georgia, that's a kind of commonality in the 1930s, 40s. Whole life claimed he was a racist. His best friends were all pastors, one of which was on the inner circle of Martin Luther King Jr.'s board. Best friend, right? So saying he's racist, yet his best friend is the most anti-racist man of the time. He allowed the first black student in the Old Miss. So very hypocritical, right? So throughout his life, he claimed this thing, and then it took till he was like 87 to finally, when he was sick and dying and had people helping around him that were of color, kind of admit it was all just a hoax, right? But where did that hoax start, and why did it start? It's just because of the way he grew up and the people around him in that little tiny bubble made it seem like it was necessary. And then he wanted to protect that so that he would fit in with he wanted to be cool with, right? It's very silly. A super intelligent man to try this. He worked 20 years in a charity hospital doing heart surgery on majority minority patients. So he's the biggest hypocrite I know, but I think that's a common thing that happens in our societies. These people tell themselves this story that they need to stick to this context and don't know how to get out of that bubble. It took my granddad 87 years to get there, but he got there. The cool thing now is that kids have the internet and their heroes are all different colors, all different backgrounds, all different nations. So I know from the younger generation that'll go down a little bit, and the understanding and awareness of one another will be much, much better. But it's that gap in between, the one you mentioned, the one that we've lived through something before. And at the time we knew what we were talking about. And then, wow, eyes open, iPhone showing me what they had been talking about, what people had told me was happening. And I didn't really think, maybe that happens every now and then. Now it's in your face. Now what are you going to do about it? Now you're going to be proactive. So I feel like we need to stretch that out and make sure, like you mentioned, people are receptive to it, but make sure that that training is actually effective. It's not just a PowerPoint that you click through, but some kind of personal engagement that I have that connects me with other people.
Yeah, and you can get a sense of how important this is and how you it's both community and communal in terms of organizations as well as it is the individual. And of course, it always, we can say we're in this together. We're only truly in anything together when we have a common way of understanding one another. So you can't really have a community without having the individual diversity. You can't really truly have real inclusion without truly the accepting of one another in that construct. And I think what you're saying here is real important, because unless we all come to the place of understanding that, then just look at it through the lens of how important businesses to our local economies at the neighborhood level, at the city and the regional level. And then you start also looking at that through the lens of the organization. And you realize that unless we're able to truly listen and accept what we have to say to one another and hear it from one another, it's going to be really difficult for us to really manifest a level of innovation that's possible. Because you can see what can happen here is unless you innovate to move it forward, then you're actually just asking yourself to get on that hamster wheel of repeating the past again and not having that forward progress. And one of the most important things I think here that we will see happening in corporations is to not just be speaking to it and trying to send out messages that make themselves look good. Now we're talking about internalizing the problem solving to actually affecting their cultures. Now let's affect the culture of the organization. Let's start asking some really key questions. What is the diversity of leadership in our organization? Are we really doing what we need to be doing to recruit and find a diverse population to bring into our organizations? Do we train our leadership? I think a lot of this has to do with how well is that we prepare people for leadership roles in organizations, and that we're able to identify how it is that we can do a much better job of making sure that's more inclusive and that's more diverse, and that we bring leaders along in organizations that are going to be able to influence the strategies of our businesses in a much more meaningful way, in a much more powerful way, in terms of being able to integrate differing ideas and different experiences so that we can actually reflect what's going to be now happening at a different level in the marketplace. So yeah, does this all make great business sense? Absolutely. Does it make innovative sense? Absolutely. I mean, there's no question about that. We know that. And coming from the place of working in the realm of design and innovation, you realize the importance of all those differing viewpoints and those different ideas and experiences coming into how it is that we solve problems and we create the great designs, the great innovations for the future, including the social context.
Yeah, John, I have a question for you. You mentioned you were working with HR managers, and Edgar just kind of popped an idea into my head. I know that, well, people, whenever they're dating someone, a lot of times they date someone that looks like their mom or their family member because it's like this comfort level, right? The same thing happens when you're hiring, right? You interview people and then you end up hiring someone that kind of has the same feel, maybe skin tone, maybe eye color, maybe just background in general. How do you set up HR people? How have they talked to you about this, and how do you help them kind of with those blind spots? Right.
The conversation basically ended with the most immediate one or most recent one with my friend saying, this isn't a job for HR. And this is someone that's got 30 plus years of experience in HR.
Yeah.
It says, we're not equipped. And, she's like, I like HR, I like what I do, but this really is an area that we're not equipped right now to address. The teams don't have those skills necessarily. And so that's why I look to, I'm not an HR, professional. That's not my background. That's not the space that I play in. But I come to it more from the business and the operations side of it, right? And the human side of it, which is I've lived it. I understand what it's like to have a feet in two worlds. I understand, you know, like we talked about last week, how do you kind of do that code switching and how do you manage that? And how do you understand different environments? And so that's what I say is that HR probably isn't going to be the organization to help us get out of this. I think it's got to come from leadership. I think it just has to be one of these scenarios where we start to look at diversity and cultural awareness as another competency, right? So we talk about, you know, oh, what's your EQ? What's your emotional IQ? Well, we've also got to start talking about what's your cultural IQ, right? How well do you understand these cultures? How well do you understand and have an ability to extract the brilliance? You know, and one thing that I'm going to guess we're going to see here probably in the next 6 months as we start to get more earnings reports is a separation, right? A separation of the firms that do that well, that can integrate their diverse teams who have, through COVID and through this racial awareness time, been able to separate because they can innovate faster, because they can create better, they can problem solve faster, right? And you start looking at like a friend that works for a huge international company. You know, they were looking at the changes that they were going to need to make to their supply chain in January, right? When they started seeing the early things from COVID. And so to me, that's where we've got to start looking like, who are these firms that are getting it right now? Because I think those are the ones that probably have the most diversity and the highest level of that integration, or kind of, I think Edgar, we were talking about it kind of almost like a equality, right? Right. My ability to understand where you come from, accept the experiences you have, to then come to collectively together to make it better. And I think that's what we're going to see is that there's a lot of companies that have either pivoted recently and are just really going to do well because they've got the skills and they've got the team in-house that does it. Otherwise, we're going to see firms that are stuck and they're going to try to wait it out. Mm-hmm. They're going to try to wait it out and go back to the old way of being.
I think it's worth repeating a couple of things that you just said that are so valuable. One is it's not a human resource practice. I agree with you. I think this is a leadership practice. You just can't put a process in place. You just can't do Black History Month and all the things that we've done. You just can't come at it in that same way anymore. There's a mastery, a discipline at play here that needs to be engaged in to take it much further. So I agree with you there wholeheartedly, and it comes back to the leadership piece. And I think it's also this idea of training. I think that facilitators and people in leadership positions that are responsible for making innovation work at higher levels, I think across the board, the training, everything needs to be improved and increased. When we did the research for innovation by design, and what we found in that book was that the true innovative leaders spend a lot of time training people. And I think this is another facet, another aspect of how we train people to do innovation and teach them to do design. So I think that's an important one. Another thing that I think that you hit on, John, is the span. Look at it through this lens. Vendors. How are we treating our vendors? What is our vendor select? When a problem shows up in our supply chain, how quickly can we turn to them and ask them to help us problem solve? And what are all the possibilities that can show up? And again, the more diverse of a set of possibilities that we have and resources that we have, then the more that we can tap into that part of our community, that part of our business that we can extend to, and bring that power into the fold of how it is that we can quickly move and be agile. It's kind of interesting how much it is that people depend on themselves or small groups to say, look how agile we are, without really being able to remind themselves of the interdependence that's required for that to actually work, especially when you start scaling it. So all of those are just, thanks, John. Great. Yeah.
Yeah, and cultural IQ. I think that's an interesting
Yeah.
concept. I not to make my schools look bad or anything, but I know we had a tendency throughout the school year to only get so far into American history. And it was always like got to like 1960 and it was May. Timing issue, whatever the issue was. Looking back on it, it's like, wow, we missed a big important chunk of American history there. Like some big moments happen in America and in the world. And when you said cultural IQ, just straight jumped to my mind. Like, what would that look like as a training session if we started it maybe even before? You said it's not a human resources problem. Well, it's a human problem. So, what would it look like if we started it before they got to the workforce, before people arrived to the time when they're hunting for a job, and actually integrated that into a classroom or some type of program that help people collaborate and understand different races, different backgrounds, different experiences earlier on in the process, made it kind of more formal because, like you said, human resources can't shoulder that weight. It's more the people coming in, right, than the person sitting there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point because unless we come at it from the standpoint of systems thinking, in other words, to look at it systemically as a whole. And again, that's why I come back to the idea of our business society and the responsibility of business to think about this in a much more systemic way in terms of the influence of business, the impact that business has, and to be able to see this in a much more systemic way. And I think you're right. And I don't think that we do a good enough job of teaching critical thinking and problem solving and systems thinking skills. One of the things we're doing at the Anderson College of Business and Community of Regis is looking at everything through that lens. And it becomes a very, very powerful lens to look at it through. So we're having this ongoing conversation about the stewardship of business and the responsibility of business to society. That's always part of the conversation. I don't know if we're always putting that conversation up front where it needs to be. And right now, that's part of the conversation. That we're being more or less, in a way, in some instances, people are feeling forced into that conversation. Yet that's the conversation that we ought to be putting at the forefront continuously.
And Edgar, when you say they're forced into the conversation, is that a result of the times of leadership, of both? All? I don't know.
Well, yeah, yeah, and I think it's both, and it's yeah. When we think about context, time, place, setting, the influences of society, we've got this just tremendous connectivity between our political landscape and our business landscape. It's really one and the same. I come back to again, we've got capitalistic democracy that we're engaged in, and it's important to realize again that, and that goes back to the idea of that Jon brought up around the systems thinking part of it, and how do we do that effectively? Yeah, I think a lot of right now people are feeling like they're forced into the conversation because it's all around them and they can't avoid it, which is a very, very different approach than I want to be ongoing, have this conversation. Let's keep this moving and always make this a centerpiece of how we conduct business and how we do things.
Yeah, and I mean, I know the situation has been not forcing. It's just like you can't. It's in front of your face, so no matter where you look, you see it, right? And that makes people uncomfortable because they don't want to see it. And I definitely think it ties in some ways to the fear that Jon, you were mentioning earlier. And it's probably a lot of times an exaggerated fear. I know that there's only a couple of examples where I think businesses have really reacted super strongly to, say, a professional soccer player from the MLS was sent away from his team, mutually agreed to leave his team because his wife made some really horrible posts on Instagram or TikTok, whatever it may be. That's a really strong reaction. There are other examples of backlash from a company being very strong, and people use that as like a crutch to fall back on. But those are really the outliers. Most of the time, companies are trying to at least appear that they stand for something, and then sometimes that appearance comes to be an actual value that they have. Even if in the initial piece of it, it was like to hold up their brands, as we mentioned branding earlier, it kind of becomes as the people that see that brand become hired there, they make that value hold true. So even if the initial reaction at this time is I'm going to, as a company, share this message and speak to this message because I know I need to do it to appear one way in society. In the end, they're actually going to become that way. So they might have just tricked themselves into becoming a better company, right?
Well, yeah, let's hope so.
Let's
I
hope
mean,
so.
that would be it when the actions actually align to the words that are being spoken. And I
Mm-hmm.
think one of the things that people have become maybe accustomed to a great extent over at least, when you look at the boomer generation, is you kind of keep moving and you become used to it. And I think now there's an opportunity when you see who's really in the streets protesting and you start seeing the demographics of it. It's really, I think it's a wonderful thing to be seeing that we have the younger people in our culture and the younger people in our society, the ones that are really right now questioning and they're seeking greater authenticity and the greater openness. And keep in mind, underlying at the very human level of our experience to one another, that openness and authenticity is actually a form of caring. It's a form of acceptance. And so, even in contextual inquiry, when we listen to somebody's experience, what we're doing is that we listen openly and we accept that experience. Doesn't mean we have to agree with it. We accept it at the level that I want to understand your experience. At that moment, that openness, that's an indicator of acceptance of one another, which is really at the end of the day what it is that we're seeking for one another in terms of our humanity in society. And to be able to then, if you could, here's the imagination piece, look at that and see that as being day in and day out the way that organizations and business functions, which then becomes the way that society functions. That's the aspiration I think that most people share.
Yeah, Edgar, I think it's interesting too, this point that you bring up around, I think the chicken and the egg almost between business and society.
Yeah.
But boy, you think about, most of us spend 8, 9, 10 hours a day kind of in this business mindset. And especially with COVID now, our social contact is lessened,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think for the younger generation, as you said, though, social media, they have figured out a way to kind of deal with the lack of contact, and maybe they're a little bit better at it. But I do agree with you that it's the youth, I think, that are going to have that level of awareness. And then it becomes, to me, how do we enable these youth to really take the lead, right? So we've got some lessons we can share. We've learned, we've seen some things as we've gone through the years. But boy, how do we enable them? And how do we, as kind of senior leaders, step to the side a little bit and provide the right level of support? Because I think at some point we've got to realize that the way we've been doing it, and I'll even say, I'm a Generation X guy.
Mm-hmm.
It might be time for us to step aside. Even as many of us are just kind of getting to that age, but maybe not give up full reins. But boy, there's a lot more sharing, I think, of process. I'm not going to say of power or control, but it's really a sharing of process that would enable, I think, a better future for us. And it's just, am I willing to do that?
And I think you're right. I think part of it is to establish a couple of pieces in this. One I think you're right, process and practice, and to do that. The other one, I think there is that power piece in it that says that we want to have a shared influence. And so I think inviting people to a dialogue, and a dialogue that also speaks to transition, to planning for the future, and to have that kind of a dialogue so that the next generations get a sense of empowerment, not just feeling it, also taking it on, and that we see it in their behavior. And I think that's important. And I think one of the most important elements of the current moment is not to see it as another singular event, because we've seen the protests of the past We go all the way back to the 1960s and the civil rights movement and everything that we see. And here's another a set of events, and I think we owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to the dialogue, that we all see this as not being another singular event or something that comes and goes without having real change, without having a real change societally. And I think it's also a moment in which business needs to be able to see it through that lens, that this is not just another launch. It's not just a singular event. This is something that needs to be integrated into their cultures, into their teams, into their organizations as a cultural aspect of how it is that people behave and how they act and how they innovate and create solutions together. I think that's the opportunity to be able to embed it in that way. And I think, and I say this with great caution, probably because of my age, and I look at my experiences in my life, and I look back at it and I see them as events. And I'm yet to really, I can see some threads. I think now's the opportunity to see this not just as a singular set of events again. I think it's time for us to be able to move that much further and integrate into our day-to-day lives and into our businesses at a much deeper level what this represents.
I did some looking into just what you were talking about, because I got really inspired. Like I do, I have a crazy brain. I get really inspired with topics. And so
That's true.
Some kids here locally, kids, 16, 17 years old, were the ones that organized and started the protest at the state capitol that thousands of people ended up showing up at. So did some research, got on Twitter, ended up contacting this group of amazing students, is what they are, and tried to set them up with a workshop. The odd thing is when someone just randomly reaches out to you on Twitter that you don't know, that's older than you, not so receptive, right? The guy I spoke with, Noah Hawkins, great person, but couldn't convince him that the process that I wanted to show him was worthwhile for strategizing. A protest is a moment, but a process could last forever and make permanent change. So I then kind of spaced out and looked around what organizations are doing this and doing it well. And in Chicago, there's one called Greater Good. That's a design agency, but designed for social change. And they've got it down pat. And I just think we need more of those groups that are using the power of design and have resources and are actively helping out the community in solving those core problems and giving them the skill set so they can go off and solve the problems on their own. I don't need to be there for Noah to change the world. I just know that if I can share that little bit I have, then he can be much better than me in that direction he's going. So I think we need to create a system for that. I haven't found that yet, and I would love to see that.
I think I don't know what the process is that's being used by Greater Good.
Mm-hmm, Greater Good. It's a guy from IDEO originally, I believe.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense too. My sense of it would be this, that I can come to you and offer you a process, which sounds like I'm giving you advice and I'm giving you a solution.
Yeah.
And that's very different than coming to you and saying, what do you need? What do you need?
Definitely.
And what do you need from us to help you do that? Which is has a different approach. And somebody says, well, I don't need your help. And sometimes the best thing to do is say, well, that's okay too. And if that ever does show up on your radar screen, so to speak, if it ever does show up in your world, that I can be of help to you, let me know. And to move that way. Keep in mind, one of the things that we've faltered, and we do this in business too, like HR can create a program without actually talking to the people that are directly impacted by the program. Right. We don't really do a good enough job of prototyping, creating feedback loops, let alone starting at the front end, which is that step number one is to intentionally empathize. And I think that's offering coming at it, somebody with a solution is very different than asking them, what do you need and what does that look like? And I think we're still struggling with doing that. Mm-hmm. and getting to that. I think we haven't created the dialogues yet that are about understanding and about seeking what other people perceive to be the solution, as opposed to ours.
And Edgar, the big piece of that in my mind is trust, right? Is that I have to know you at some level to be able to trust that you have good intentions, right? It's not necessarily so much about whether or not I believe your process is good or works or whatever, but it's more around, do I trust you, right? Are you a known quantity to me? And so, if you've been hanging around these kids, JSaye, let's just say, for a couple months, and you've been posting on their Twitter feed or whatever, then I think that the receptiveness might be a little bit different, right? They're going to be more receptive. They know you, you're a known quantity. They get kind of what you're doing. But I fully agree with what Edgar says, though, right? Is there is this beginning step that we all have to take, right? We all have to sit down and agree that, hey, this is the space I am in, and my level of openness is going to grow. And that's the work, it really is the work. It's just saying, I'm here, I am a resource. And if you ever need me, want me, call, right? And to me, that feels a lot better than saying, I've got the solution for you. And I'm not saying, JSaye, that that's what you said, but I think
no.
In other circles, I think we're saying, I know the solution. Well, you don't even know me or the problem, So the idea that you know the solution is hard to accept. But collectively, we'll find that solution because you've got a little bit of the right answer. I've got a little bit of the right answer. And that's where the brilliance shows up. And that's, I think, what we're all saying here today is that we've got to find ways to extract our collective brilliance, because when we let it sit in pockets, it does nothing.
Yeah, and you just cannot do that until you build the best way to build the trust is by listening. So you can't do that until you fearlessly explore someone else's experience, wholeheartedly agreeing. So the trust really does begin with that openness aspect of listening and wanting to know you and your experience.
Yeah, and I definitely think y'all made some great points, and even using that case of me as an example, I mean, better to integrate and become a part of the community and develop trust in a much more personal way than just show up on someone's Twitter feed, right? So, I mean, point taken. I definitely would need to be more active in day to day and not just try and show up in emergencies. I think that's one way to integrate into other communities and share my knowledge, other groups, and share my knowledge. But it's just when there's sometimes when you see a keyhole and you have a key, you're like, let me fix that lock for you, right? It's so tempting. No matter how much experience you might have in design or interacting with other people, you just so eager to help that you jump to the conclusion. And then we've created the cycle again.
I think there's something important too here, is that the idea of what are you willing to invest, much like you helping a group of younger people, a community of younger people. Mm-hmm. How much are you willing to invest in that? And a lot of that investment is time. Yeah. Keep in mind, when we listen and we open up to someone, what we're actually doing is giving them the gift of time. And we all know how valuable that one is. And do we take the time to listen, to build the relationships and develop the trust that's necessary for us to work at the kind of levels that we're seeking? And that happens within teams and organizations and communities alike. So, yeah.
Yeah, Edgar, I'm glad you brought that up too, this idea of time, because I'm seeing a lot of good coming out of this in terms of people being more aware. I'm seeing also a lot of, and especially I kind of still follow the tech venture capital kind of space a little bit, and I'm seeing a lot of people that are throwing money at this, which is fine as long as you're giving it to a right organization, that has been doing the work and is aligned. But the real value, I think, for a lot of them, especially when I think about tech and VC, is the time, right? It's not, the money is important, but the time and the network. Are you going to open up your network and your resources to me, not just your financial resources, but all the other resources that you have? And that's the bigger piece to me is that we'll see coming out of this is those organizations and people, I think, who are able to give and invest their time in understanding and collectively developing and discussing solutions are going to be the winners by far. because I think, just like we said, you're going to have that understanding that then is the platform for you to explore a lot of other options that just weren't even possible before then.
I agree. The generosity of time is priceless. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder, if we have, and go back to JSaye's initial question, right, around where do we go wrong, right, and is it something about the way that we've shared or not shared our time with each other, with our communities, that put a pause on things? Right, many of us have become, especially I think since civil rights movement, so focused on, making money and kind of the business corporate world that we really have become distracted from or distanced from our social lives, our communities. Mm-hmm. I don't know, but that really makes me think back to that question and wonder whether or not the social piece of this has something to do with it.
Yeah, I definitely think it does. I look to my grandmother, who's still incredibly active, like social queen of Baton Rouge, but she's in every single group. And I feel like that generation was much more dedicated to being social, but also volunteering and trying to make an impact at the same time. And nowadays, I speak for my generation, my group of friends, I'm not seeing much volunteering. The time spent socializing is much more online, playing video games, or just one-on-one. We're not actively going out and making the world a better place while making jokes about each other, like hanging out like it would be normal. So maybe that's a gap that my generation missed that we definitely need to work on. I know plenty of other people are volunteering, but I think in general, the generation a few back did a much better job.
I think it's nice that we have generational diversity here today.
We definitely
about that.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself an international, Edgar, or no?
What do I can my generational diversity? I consider myself to be an older person, and not always wiser.
Yeah, no, I think that's a big thing. The more you do, the less you know is 100% true. I was born to know it all, and progressively have gotten less that way. So I guess we just flew through an hour, guys. Just yeah, incredible. I don't know if we want to wrap it up here. Do we have any
Thank you.
final
I'm glad we
thoughts?
came up for a short breath.
Yeah, we did. We did. You promised it was going to fly by, John. You were right. You said it was going to be a crunch time hour.
Yeah, that's true. That's, and I appreciate the conversation. I think that it's fascinating to me to talk about where we're headed, and to think about it. And I hope people that watch this later or that are online are kind of doing the same thing, which is, as we said, it's not just this one moment, that this is a shift. And then the question becomes, how do I make sure that I'm ready and my community is ready for this shift?
Yeah,
Thank
definitely.
you.
And I mean, it's a pleasure to be able to learn and share with both of you. I know sometimes I'm an open book, so I might tell a lot of stories or random stories or uh, misspeak a few times, but I really appreciate being able to learn how I think from
Likewise. Likewise, JSaye. Well, I'll add this to it. If anyone wants to connect with us, I think that'd be a great idea. I think the best place to do that is probably through LinkedIn right now. Or John, any other words of advice around how to connect?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I'd say LinkedIn, or even, the noalign.net has a lot of what we're doing right now on there too. But I'm super excited right now just to reach out and have these conversations with folks, because it's been a long time coming. So we're ready.
Yep. Thank you.
All right. Well, I guess this was Innovation Hour with a bonus guest. So Innovation Hour with Edgar, JSaye, and John, part 2. So I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back next week. Thanks again for stopping by, John.
Thanks for the invite, guys.
Thank you both very, very much. Bye-bye.